Did you know that there are over 1 million family and friend caregivers across Alberta? It's a staggering number, and behind every one of those caregivers is a powerful story. These are people caring for parents, partners, children, friends, neighbors, and community members, often without recognition and sometimes without support. I'm Jonna Lowther, and you're listening to Behind the Care. This podcast is dedicated to caregivers, the unsung heroes who show up day after day with compassion, resilience, and heart. Together, we'll explore the challenges they face, the moments that keep them going, and the strength it takes to care for someone else while trying to care for yourself too. Whether you're a caregiver or someone who wants to better understand what caregivers go through, you're in the right place. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And now let's get straight into it. Hello and good afternoon to our listeners. This is Jonna Lowther. I am your podcast host for Behind the Care, Caregivers Alberta's podcast. And with us today is our guest, Suneet Jaswal with Calgary Meals on Wheels. He is their registered dietitian. And Suneet, welcome today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Tell our listeners just about your role a little with Calgary Meals on Wheels, if you would.
Absolutely. So my role here is quite expansive. I kind of dip my toes all over the organization, I would say. Within the production department, I support a lot with the menu development, the recipe development, but then also what we call our compliances, which is just making sure that we are sending the correct type of food to the correct people, depending on their medical needs. With the marketing department, I work a lot on the website, just making sure that all of our nutrient tables are up to date, all our allergens are up to date, so that way all our agency partners and anyone ordering frozen meals from us has accurate information. And then with our programs department, I am involved with client intakes. Every now and then we will get a client that is a little bit more medically complex that they might not feel comfortable doing the intake for. And in that situation, I'll support and give them a hand so they know which medical diet that client should be on. And then lastly, I do occasionally kind of dip my toes with the philanthropy department in case there's something that needs to be done in terms of a grant or a new project that we're starting.
Awesome. Well, yes, you wear quite a few hats there with the organization. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Most nonprofit jobs are that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which makes it that much richer, I think, right? To have that, intercollaborative work with your colleagues and across job duties.
I totally agree.
Yeah. Tell us how many clients that you are serving.
Right now, on average, we tend to see about 500 daily clients. So those are the clients that are getting a meal from us for the most part, anywhere from 3 to 7 days per week. They're getting lunch or supper. And those are the clients where our volunteer drivers are delivering to them. Outside of that, we also then send meals to 54 schools across the city. And then outside of that, we also have several agency partners in rural communities around Calgary. So these are agency partners like FCSS offices or local Meals on Wheels that don't have the ability to produce food. So they will order food from us and come pick it up and then deliver it within their own communities.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that in the Lunch and Learn webinar that we did, several months ago, and that I thought that was super cool. That like you weren't just serving, clients in your own client base, but that you were partnering with other agencies to even reach that many more people, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We sometimes get a little bit limited with the delivery, and so that's where these agencies will then find someone that will be able to drive into the city, pick up those meals, then take it back. It'd be fantastic if we had a slightly more robust distribution system to be able to handle some of that ourselves. But it's been working fantastically, and the agency partners really appreciate what we do, and we're more than happy to be able to support them any way we can.
Well, and I thought that was really cool because, like, for instance, in more rural areas that don't have access to as many types of services, that this was a great partnership that allowed more services in other communities.
Yes, so absolutely.
That was just super cool to me. Yeah. So we're here today to talk about, nutrition from a caregiver's perspective, and caregivers are individuals, supporting people living with illness, disability, aging-related needs. There's a lot of various nutritional challenges, that they can be experiencing as well with their loved one. I'd like to talk about that, so what are their care recipients, common challenges when it comes to nutrition, but then also we'll a little later in the conversation can dig into the nutritional health of the caregiver themselves, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah.
how about we start there? And from your perspective, what are some of the most common nutritional challenges faced by family and friend caregivers with a loved one?
Yeah, from what we tend to see is some of the most common challenges tend to be that caregivers are not self-centered enough. They tend to develop almost a care recipient first mindset where they become so focused on meeting the needs of their loved one that their own basic needs start to almost fall to the bottom of that priority list.
Mm.
And so often what I end up seeing is that caregivers are skipping meals, they're eating irregularly, not drinking enough fluids, not necessarily because they don't know it's important, but because caregiving is constantly pulling them away and pulling their attention away. And so there's always something more urgent to do or something to care for or another task that feels like it's more important than just sitting down and having a meal or even a snack or drinking a couple of sips of water. And so over time, this can kind of create a cycle where that low food and water intake leads to low energy and and loss of fatigue. And when you're exhausted, it's even harder to prepare those meals, plan a snack, think about hydration. And so then that causes those meals and those eating patterns to become even more irregular, which then worsens the fatigue even further. And so
Mm.
then in the long term, this pattern increases your risk for nutrient deficiencies, which then weakens your immune system, slows down your recovery from illness or injury, and then just reduces overall resilience. And so it's not just about feeling tired, it's also about the impact to your health and then the caregiver's ability to continue providing care sustainably for their care recipient and their loved one.
Yeah, we we know from research evidence, and then we also just hear it, with our clients, how, many will say, I feel like I come down with some sort of illness, common cold, for example, and I just really can't crawl out of that hole. Like I
Mhm.
feel like I'm constantly just catching the next thing, right?
Yeah,
And I don't think very often people stop to think about the fact that it could be something as simple as nutrition. I mean,
mhm.
so this is a great discussion to be having today.
Absolutely.
Um, so what would you say then are sort of like some of the strategies that you recommend for caregivers to maintain energy and focus on their own nutrition and maybe just remembering to eat and drink?
Yeah, it can be quite a challenge. The first strategy would probably be to try to eat consistently. Ideally, that means something at least every 3 or 4 hours. There also tends to be a little bit of a perfection mindset that can sometimes happen, and they think that it needs to be a full meal or a perfect snack. But the key message is always that eating something is always better than eating nothing.
Mm.
And so a regular intake of food, regardless of what it is, helps stabilize those energy levels, helps support your concentration and your mood. And so if we can have those times where we already have a care plan for our caregiver, we know we want our care recipient, we know we want
Hmm.
our loved one to eat their meals on time. That is also the time for us to sit down, have something. Doesn't have to be perfect, a little nibble of something here and there, just so that we're supporting our energy levels by getting something in at least every couple of hours.
Hmm.
The second strategy I would probably say is finding a structure for your meals so that way you're not doing a lot of mental fatigue trying to figure out what you're going to have for each meal. So what I typically end up suggesting is trying to follow the plate model from Canada's Food Guide. So have a three main components, which are your protein, your whole grain, and then fruits or vegetables. This combination supports that fullness and that energy, but then also helps reduce your risk for nutrient deficiencies. And so often, and we talked about this a little bit in the webinar as well, is ask yourself, look at your plate, what am I missing? Am I missing a protein? Am I missing my whole grain? Or am I missing my fruit or veg? And if you're missing something, let's just throw it in. So, for example, if it's something as simple as some spaghetti and meatballs, you might look at that plate and realize, oh, I'm a little bit low on my veg. So how about, I could toss some spinach in with the noodles, or maybe even something as simple as munching on a couple of baby carrots, just to help bulk out that veg component a little bit more. And that will help keep us full, keep those energy levels nice and high, but then also reduce those risks for nutrient deficiencies. And then the third main thing that I think is really, really important is foresight and planning for those low energy or high demand days, because those are guaranteed to happen when you're a caregiver.
Yeah.
You're going to be running from appointment to appointment to appointment. And so that means having pre-made meals, easy snacks, canned or frozen foods, or even just generic quick grab and go items available will make that process of eating consistently a lot easier. So microwavable meals, canned soups, trail mixes, or granola bars, those will act as support tools to help nourish you when your capacity to do that yourself is low.
Yeah, I find I can, as you're talking, I'm just recalling some of my own experiences of being a mother, with children and creating children back and forth between school and, and me resulting to eating the same snacks I'm giving them. So that's great. I just have to
Yeah,
make sure they're healthy snacks, right? Like
yeah,
I
absolutely.
literally remember eating the squeezy baby food containers
Yeah.
when I had toddlers, like eating them right alongside them in the car. But the nutritional value is there, right?
Absolutely. And because you're still getting something in relatively regularly, it's
Hmm.
keeping your mood and your energy up. So that way, when you do have a little bit of downtime, you have the energy to be able to make something a little bit nicer and potentially more nutritiously dense once you do get home.
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, the squeezable foods actually are a really great source of, not just like filling, but again, like that it's not a candy bar or a soda when those are
Mhm.
just, such easy things to resort to.
Yep, absolutely. And even those in some certain situations, as I mentioned, better than nothing. If
Hmm.
that's all you have available, yeah, let's have some Coke, let's have a Kit Kat, because that
It's
will at
true.
least sustain you for a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. My husband is a remote field scientist, and he just tucks Snickers candy bars in the pockets. So when they're like out and things go awry and they're kind of stuck with no access to food, he's got something super quick that's a energy generator.
Yep, perfect. That's exactly what we'd want.
Yeah. Um, so when we talk about nutrient-rich meals, caregivers will often say they struggle with finding the time to prepare. And so you talked about following the plate guide. What did you call that? The plate model?
The plate model. So with Canada's new food guide that was released in 2019, they switched from the pyramid that most people were familiar with to more of a plate model to show kind of what proportions of your meal should be a whole grain, a protein, or a veg.
Yeah. And so then how do you follow that concept quickly, like without spending a lot of time cooking or preparing food?
Yeah, yeah, actually, perfectly as you mentioned, time and I would maybe also argue energy are usually those biggest barriers, not necessarily the motivation or the knowledge. And so when we're trying to follow Canada's food guide as a simple foundation for how to naturally build and support a balanced, nutrient dense meal, it allows us to do so without adding a bunch of complexity. And so the goal is always having those three main components, your protein, your whole grain, and your fruit or veg, and not necessarily having superfoods or specific food items that sometimes will get a lot of marketing thrown at them, but aren't necessarily supporting you in the way that you need to be supported. So some of the most practical methods I would probably say are things like one pot or sheet pan meals, because in those situations you can typically just throw your protein, your veg, and then often a grain such as like a potato into one single dish, and then you're done. Throw it in the oven, throw it in the pot. Things like pastas, stews, casseroles, or just as I mentioned, those sheet pan meals typically require minimal prep, not a whole lot of cooking skill, and then very easy cleanup as well, which makes it a very sustainable type of cooking style for caregivers. But
Hmm.
then that style of cooking can also be used for batch cooking. And a lot of those things that I mentioned can be batch cooked where you're making several larger quantities so that we are not cooking every single day. And then on top of things like the stews and the casseroles, you can also do things like breakfast burritos or egg bites or soups. And those also freeze very well. So it's easy to have those ready in the freezer. So that way, when you have a low energy or a high demand day, you have a homemade meal or a snack even that you can pull from the freezer and reheat. If
Yeah.
your sorry, if your
I,
budget allows, I also sometimes suggest just buying assembly meals from the grocery store as long as they follow Canada's food guide. Get a bagged salad, get a rotisserie chicken, and some microwavable rice. You have a perfect balanced meal right there, and it was essentially zero prep. Sandwiches, wraps. These meals still meet your nutritious needs without kind of the time of their prep and the mental load of cooking, but it does obviously require that there is the financial resources there to be able to accommodate that.
yeah, I was just gonna go back and say that like the egg bites, right? Like that's something that I don't honestly don't always remember. But then
Mhm.
how quick and easy and nutritious and filling that like they check a lot of boxes, right?
Absolutely. Yep. And they freeze very, very well. And
Yeah.
they tend to thaw very well as well. You can have them cold, but if you don't want them cold, you can warm them up in the microwave. So yeah, they are very versatile.
Well, yeah, and if you have a little more, financial resources, you can buy them pre-made, but they're also you can also make them easily yourself too. It's not
Absolutely.
labor intensive.
Mhm.
Do you find that of the clients you're serving, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but do you know, like, do you see a lot of like caregivers, in that role as a caregiver, purchasing or receiving meals for them and their care recipient?
Unfortunately, no. A lot of our clients tend to be caregivers signing up their care recipient, but then the caregiver themselves aren't getting the meals. They're
Mm,
getting meals for their loved one. It'll often be a mom, a son or a daughter
yeah,
purchasing meals for their mom or dad. And often it tends to be those medical diets where the son or daughter doesn't feel comfortable figuring out how to make a renal friendly meal for their mom or dad that has kidney failure. And so they end up relying on us. Um, and so, our situation, I find that actually the caregivers aren't really reaching out for
mhm.
supports. They're taking some of the mental load off by getting supports for their loved ones, but they're not necessarily getting a whole lot of support themselves.
Yeah. So most of your clients are sounds like people living alone.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's opportunity there, right, for us to bring this to the attention of more caregivers, especially like, spousal caregivers, you know, who could benefit
Absolutely.
as well from meal service, right? Because you talked about like the cost as well. Let's talk about that because it's
Yeah.
really cost effective. So like, how much does it cost to come get a meal from Meals on Wheels?
Yeah, so it tends to differ a fair bit depending on which Meals on Wheels you're going to. Obviously, I'm more familiar with Calgary Meals on Wheels, but for us, um, a standard lunch and supper package is about 14.50 as of right now. But we have subsidies. So depending on the income of the person receiving the meals, not the person that's purchasing the meals, we have quite a few aggressive subsidies. So we have quite a few clients that are getting lunch and supper delivered to them every single day, and they're paying about $4 a day.
Mm.
Um, and then for those that want a little bit more flexibility and they are okay with the frozen meals, those are 6.50 each, which is still a fair bit cheaper than if you were to order something off Uber Eats or even some other groceries pre-made meals like
Yeah.
M&Ms or things like that.
Or the meal, the meal platforms, like
Yes,
HelloFresh
HelloFresh.
and yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. When we think about food and like we have to eat to live, right?
Mhm.
But then people don't always enjoy the act of eating. Like my mother would tell you, like, I've never really enjoyed eating and therefore I don't really enjoy cooking, right?
Mhm.
But you know, eating together with someone can be this, part of your social emotional health. So
Yes.
let's talk about nutrition in that sense, right? Like
Mhm.
how you can maybe enjoy, eating more by approaching it from that perspective of getting some social engagement out of it, or how our senses of, remembering a certain food or a taste in our mouth or an experience of sitting down at a table with someone brings back positive memories. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that sometimes when you are a caregiver, I'm a caregiver myself, is the focus is so much on I need to make sure that my loved one is eating enough. And it becomes this very kind of rigid, black and white, quantifiable experience when that's not what a mealtime should be. There is a lot of cultural and identity and social value in just sharing a meal together. And so in those situations, I do try to say is that mealtime doesn't have to be perfect for it to be meaningful or nourishing or valuable. It should be a low pressure time where it's time together that happens to include food. It's not necessarily a test of how much someone eats or making sure they're getting enough nutrients. That conversation, that presence, that shared routine matter more than necessarily what's on the plate. And then actually, since we're on this topic as well, I might I want to bring up actually the idea of autonomy, especially for the loved one and the care recipients, because food is often one of the last areas of personal control that many care recipients still have. And so choice and preference and independence in that mealtime experience has a lot of value for their dignity and identity and emotional well-being. And so even if as caregivers we provide even a small choice of how much would you like to eat, it kind of preserves their sense of control and respect. It protects their autonomy. And then often when we do have concerns about our care or our care recipients or our loved ones refusing meals, having a more positive meal experience by protecting their autonomy builds that trust and makes mealtime feel safer and then more collaborative rather than confrontational.
Yeah, because if you make it an argument every time you're going to eat, it's going to reduce
Mhm.
the desire to have a meal,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So it's back to your point of, eating something versus nothing is better. And
Mhm.
even, less intake, less opportunities maybe for intake, but you have a greater intake at that instance
Mhm.
because it's a more positive experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then
Yeah.
even if someone doesn't want to eat, I will always then say as well, is it's better to let go of that moment rather than trying to force that meal. Is let's keep that mealtime a positive experience. So if, let's say mom or dad or whoever you're caring for isn't eating as much as you'd like them to, that's okay. They have decided how much they want to eat. We'll just offer them a snack in a little bit just to help top them up if we want to use that language. And that way, we're not worsening that food experience and we're supporting that autonomy and we're not letting that food refusal get worse over time.
Let's talk about this phrase nutrition in disguise,
Hmm.
because very often, especially with, aging, care recipients who really just don't want to eat as much, and or often, those sweet tooth taste buds are kind of the last to die off on our tongue, right?
Yeah,
So it's more common that people just like desire to eat sweet foods, and I think there's a little bit of a lack of education, understanding sometimes on younger people of knowing that, right? Like, it's not just that, your mom or dad just wants to eat cookies all day.
yeah,
It's literally like that's the thing that they can actually taste. It's actually, creating sensation in their mouths. So it's more enjoyable to eat than something they can't even taste. So let's talk about nutrition in disguise. So how we can sneak in extra nutrition and still eat the cookies and ice cream when we want.
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you're absolutely correct. Our taste buds do weaken and get less sensitive over time. And so that's often where you'll find older adults in particular are leaning for very, very salty foods or very, very sugary foods because those are the foods that still have some flavor and
Mhm.
that they are able to appreciate and enjoy. And so with nutrition in disguise, the idea is that we're trying to sneak nutrients into comfort foods or foods that our loved ones or our care recipients like to eat, but we're able to then make them a little bit more nourishing. So we don't want to restrict them, we don't want to eliminate them, but let's take what they do enjoy eating and make it a little bit more nourishing. And so, for example, with things like ice creams or pudding, um, very, very good sources of calories, but a little bit low in protein, not a great source of fiber. So in those cases, maybe we serve it with a glass of milk. We mix a little bit of nut butter or peanut butter, almond butter on top. Just a little sprinkling of some frozen berries. Not enough to overwhelm the dish, but enough that we're sneaking something in. Same thing with the cookies or the sweets. We can pair things with dairy like milk, cheese, or yogurt. Again, the nut butters. For those older adults that do have a preference for the more savory foods, things like mac and cheese can be a comfort food because it's something we often grow up with, and it's a nice soft texture. So we can upgrade that a little bit by adding milk powder, which adds a lot of extra calories and protein to that meal. We can add pureed cannellini beans or white beans, or even blended tofu. For soups, we can make them more nourishing by adding things like cream or pureed meat, or even things like blended lentils. And so these small changes add up over time, and they improve that calorie and that protein intake without changing that comfort or that familiarity of that food. And so actually, I'll give a personal example is for my grandmother, Honey Nut Cheerios are her comfort food.
Mm-hmm.
If she says no to a meal, that is what we will offer her instead, a bowl of Honey Nut Cheerios with some milk. But as a dietitian, I recognize that that meal, while great, is low in fiber, could be a little bit higher in nutrients. So how do I do that is I sprinkle in a couple of Fiber One cereal buds into her Honey Nut Cheerios to make sure that we're not worrying about constipation. And then instead of regular milk, I end up using what's called ultra filtered milk, which is fairly widely available now in grocery stores, which typically has double the protein and the nutrients of regular milk. And so now I can feel comfortable giving her that bowl of cereal, knowing that she's getting in a bunch of nutrients, a lot of protein, and some fiber with that meal. And it's still a meal that's comfortable for her. She doesn't realize that these modifications have been made. And so because of that, she doesn't refuse either.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I use that high protein milk for my daughter, right? Who, picky eater, struggle for intake in general, and protein's our biggest challenge, I would say. So yeah. Well, thank you so much for these, not just tips and tricks, but for the conversation. It is really great to hear other caregiver strategies, and you yourself are a caregiver, so it's nice to hear, what are some of the things that other caregivers are doing? I also remember that you talked about that in the webinar about the pureed, cannellini beans and blending tofu into, things because they don't really have a lot of flavor.
Exactly.
So finding opportunities to blend those in. So that's another strategy that I have not forgotten from our previous conversation. So thank you so much for being here today. And I look forward to speaking again.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone was able to learn a little bit. And yes, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. All the best.
Thanks, Suneet.
Thank you.
A big thank you for joining us on Behind the Care today. We hope this episode offered meaningful information and support as you navigate the many ups and downs of the caregiving journey. To stay connected with resources, stories, and support for caregivers across Alberta, be sure to follow us, Caregivers Alberta, on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Caregivers Alberta is the province's only nonprofit organization solely focused on supporting unpaid family and friend caregivers. Since 2001, we've been empowering caregivers through both group and one-to-one programs, education opportunities, and community resources. With over 1 million unpaid caregivers in Alberta, we ask, who's caring for the caregivers? At Caregivers Alberta, that's our purpose, to care for and elevate the voice of caregivers so their role remains sustainable, supported, and recognized. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.